The Focke-Wulf Fw 190 appeared over the English Channel in late 1941, and the RAF pilots who survived their first encounters with it filed combat reports that their intelligence officers read with the specific skepticism of men whose existing assessments had no category for what the pilots were describing. The reports said the aircraft was faster than the Spitfire V at every altitude below 20,000 feet. They said it could outroll the Spitfire in any direction at any combat speed. They said it could dive away from pursuit with an acceleration that left the Spitfire behind as though the Spitfire had stopped. They said its armament, 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns, was heavier than anything the RAF had encountered in a single-engine fighter. The intelligence officers who received these reports had a performance envelope on file for the Messerschmitt Bf 109. The aircraft that German fighter units over France and the Channel had been flying since the Battle of Britain, and the reports they were reading described something that was not on that file and was not on any file because RAF intelligence had no record of the Fw 190's existence as an operational aircraft before it started appearing over the Channel and destroying Spitfires. Wing Commander Jamie Rankin of 92 Squadron filed one of the first assessments in November 1941 and wrote with the directness of a man who understood that lives depended on the accuracy of his words. "The aircraft I engaged today was not a Messerschmitt," Rankin wrote. "It was something we have not seen before. It was faster than my Spitfire at all altitudes I encountered it. When I attempted to follow it in a dive, it pulled away from me immediately." His report was received. It was filed. The skepticism that greeted it was the institutional difficulty of processing information that does not fit the existing framework, and the cost of that skepticism was paid by the RAF pilots who kept dying over France and the Channel in Spitfire versus against an aircraft that the intelligence system had not yet accepted was as good as the surviving pilots said it was. If you are new to this channel, subscribe now, because the event that finally forced the RAF and the USAF to confront exactly what they were fighting was not a tactical breakthrough or an intelligence operation but a German pilot who confused north for south on the afternoon of June 23, 1942, and landed his aircraft at the wrong airfield. Kurt Tank had designed the Fw 190 as a deliberate argument against everything the Bf 109 represented. Not because the 109 was a bad aircraft, but because its design philosophy had made it optimized at the cost of livability, an aircraft that extracted maximum performance from a pilot who was also managing its demanding handling characteristics and its unforgiving behavior in the corners of its performance envelope. Tank's argument was different. "I am not just designing an aircraft for aces," he said during the design process. "I am designing an aircraft for every pilot the Luftwaffe produces, including the ones who are not aces." The BMW 801 radial engine he built the aircraft around gave it power that the inline-engined 109 could not match at low and medium altitudes, and the radial's resistance to battle damage, a round that would destroy the liquid cooling system of an inline engine might not disable a radial, gave the aircraft a survivability advantage that pilots described in combat as the specific reassurance of a machine that kept running when it should have stopped. The cockpit was ergonomically excellent, the controls logically placed, the instruments well positioned, everything arranged with the specific attention of a designer who had also been a test pilot and who understood what pilots needed in the air rather than what engineers found convenient to install. The roll rate was the aircraft's most celebrated characteristic, the ailerons so responsive that Oberleutnant Joseph Priller of JG-26, who would accumulate 101 aerial victories in the aircraft, described it with the specific reverence of a man recalling something that had felt like an extension of his own intentions. "The Fw 190 was the best fighter I ever flew," Priller said in a post-war account. "It responded instantly to everything I asked of it. The roll rate was extraordinary. You could be pointing at the sky and pointing at the ground in less than a second. No Allied fighter could follow that roll." He was right about no Allied fighter following that roll. He was right until June 23, 1942, when one German pilot's navigation error made the roll's specific mechanics available to every Allied engineer and tactician who needed to understand exactly why no Allied fighter could follow it, and what the Allied fighters should do instead. Squadron leader Bobby Oxspring of 66 Squadron had been filing combat reports about the Fw-190 since the winter of 1941-42, and his reports had been received with the same institutional skepticism that had greeted Rankin's. He had engaged Fw-190s over the Channel and had survived those engagements by the specific tactical decision that a pilot makes when he encounters an aircraft his training did not prepare him for, and his survival requires accepting that this is not a fight he can win today. "It would not fight on my terms," Oxspring said in a post-war account. "Every time I maneuvered to bring it into my gun sights, it either outrolled me or outdived me. I could not catch it and I could not hold it." Wing Commander Al Deer, the New Zealand-born RAF ace who had fought through the Battle of Britain and into the Channel battles of 1941-42, delivered the same assessment with the authority of a man who had been flying combat over the Channel longer than most men who were still alive to deliver assessments. "The Fw-190 was the most unpleasant surprise I encountered in the entire war," Deer said. "We went from rough parity with the Bf-109 to being outclassed by something we did not understand. The pilots who reported what it could do were correct. Intelligence took too long to believe them." Group Captain Harry Broadhurst sent a formal assessment to Air Marshal Sholto Douglas in early 1942 that translated the pilot reports into the operational language of a senior commander describing a crisis that required a senior commander's response. "We cannot effectively escort bombers over France while the Fw-190 is superior to our fighters," Broadhurst wrote. "We are losing pilots and aircraft at rates that are not sustainable. We need either a better aircraft or better intelligence on the existing aircraft's limitations. Ideally both." He would receive both within weeks of each other in June 1942, and both of them would arrive from the same source, which was an Fw-190 on a Welsh airfield and the pilot who had landed it there. Oberleutnant Armin Faber was the Gruppenadjutant of 3/JG2, the administrative and operational adjutant of the 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 2 Richthofen, the most prestigious fighter wing in the Luftwaffe, its name carrying the specific weight of the Red Baron's legacy and its combat record carrying the specific weight of everything the wing had done over France and the Channel since the beginning of the war. He was in his mid-20s, experienced, a professional officer whose position in the Gruppe's staff reflected both his flying ability and the organizational competence that staff assignments required. On June 23, 1942, he was flying in the response to RAF Circus 194, a standard offensive sweep that the RAF had been running throughout the year, Douglas Boston bombers with Spitfire escort, the operational tempo of an air force maintaining pressure on the Luftwaffe while building toward something larger. The engagement developed over the Devon and Cornwall coast and the Bristol Channel, the large, extended, multi-aircraft combat that the circus operations consistently produced. Multiple Spitfire squadrons and multiple Fw-190 formations in an engagement that spread across miles of sky and produced the specific navigational disorientation that extended combat at altitude imposes on pilots who are managing the demands of survival rather than the demands of dead reckoning. During the engagement, Faber shot down Flying Officer Peter Stefani of 310 Czechoslovak Squadron, a Czech pilot flying a Spitfire V, one of the pilots who had escaped his occupied country to fight for the RAF and who on this afternoon became part of the chain of events that would ultimately contribute to the defeat of the aircraft that shot him down. Stefani survived. Faber continued the mission. Then the combat ended and Faber was alone over the Bristol Channel and he did not know precisely where he was. The Bristol Channel runs roughly east-west and from altitude presents a visual picture broadly similar to the English Channel. The same gray water, the same indistinct coastline, the same featureless horizon that makes navigation by visual reference alone unreliable for a disoriented pilot who is looking for confirmation of what he believes rather than evidence of where he actually is. Faber believed he was over the English Channel. He turned south, or what he believed was south. He was turning north. The Welsh coast appeared ahead of him and he identified it as the French coast. An airfield appeared below, RAF Pembrey in Carmarthenshire, a Royal Air Force station whose layout and infrastructure were not dramatically different from a French airfield at the altitude from which Faber was assessing it. He lowered his undercarriage. He extended his flaps. He flew the approach with the routine confidence of a pilot returning from a mission to a familiar base. He touched down on British soil and taxied toward the dispersal area, believing he was taxiing toward French ground crew who would refuel his aircraft and debrief his mission. Flight Lieutenant Ken Mackenzie was on the airfield and watched the FW-190 land with the specific paralysis that the situation produced in every person present. The German aircraft on the runway, the German pilot taxiing in, the gap between what was happening and what the training of every person watching it had prepared them to process. "We watched a German aircraft land on our runway," Mackenzie said in a post-war account. "There was a moment when nobody moved. The moment lasted until Warrant Officer Jeffries moved. Jeffries understood before anyone else on the airfield understood completely, understood that the German pilot would realize his mistake, that a pilot who realizes his mistake on an enemy airfield will attempt to take off, that an FW-190 attempting to take off from RAF Pembry would be back over the Bristol Channel in seconds and back over France in minutes, and the intelligence windfall that was taxiing across the runway would be gone. He ran across the airfield toward the taxiing FW-190, waving, the wave of a man who needed the pilot to believe the wave was friendly until the moment when it was too late for the pilot to do anything about the wave being something else entirely. Faber saw the waving figure and interpreted it as a ground crewman's greeting and waved back. The most consequential exchange of waves in the air war over Europe. A German pilot and a British warrant officer each believing something different about what the other's wave meant, the misunderstanding lasting only until Jeffries reached the aircraft and climbed onto the wing and opened the canopy. Faber looked up and saw a British uniform. "He looked at me," Jeffries said in his post-war account, "and I looked at him. And then he understood. I could see it in his face, the moment he understood where he was. He didn't say anything. He just put his hands up." The armed guard that had been scrambling toward the aircraft during Jeffries' run arrived within seconds. Faber was helped from the cockpit. The FW-190, work number 313, a fully operational FW-190A3, intact, undamaged, fully fueled, fully armed, sat on a Welsh airfield in British hands, and the air war over Europe had just changed in ways that neither Faber nor Jeffries could fully calculate in the moment, though both of them understood immediately that what had just happened was not a small thing. Like this video now, because what Wing Commander Hugh Wilson found when he climbed into that cockpit 10 days later is the reason that American and British pilots who flew against the FW-190 for the rest of the war came home in numbers that the 8 months before June 23, 1942 had not produced. The Air Ministry was notified within hours of Faber's landing, the report traveling up the RAF chain of command with the urgency of information that every officer who processed it understood required immediate action at the highest level. The aircraft was secured, examined, and assigned to the RAF's Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford, the organization whose specific function was exactly this, taking captured or new aircraft and extracting from them the tactical intelligence that operational squadrons needed. Squadron Leader SD Falcon, the RAF's most experienced Luftwaffe interrogation officer, conducted Faber's initial debriefing with the professional thoroughness of a man who has interrogated hundreds of German airmen and who understood before the questioning began that the aircraft was more valuable than anything Faber could voluntarily provide. Faber confirmed his name, rank, and unit, as the Geneva Convention required, and declined to provide technical information about his aircraft with the controlled composure that Falcon noted in his report. "A professional officer," Falcon wrote, "provides only what is required, has understood completely what the capture of his aircraft means, and is experiencing the specific distress of a man who has done something that cannot be undone." In France, at JG2's base, the news arrived the following morning. Major Egon Mayer, one of the wing's leading pilots with combat over France since the beginning of the war, described the atmosphere when the pilots learned what had happened. "We were told the next morning," Mayer said in accounts preserved in JG2's unit history. One of our aircraft. Intact. At an English airfield. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then someone said, "They will know everything." And we knew it was true. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Schilling, one of the ground crew who had serviced Faber's aircraft, described the specific knowledge that a man who maintains an aircraft has about what its loss means. "We had serviced that aircraft," Schilling said. "We knew every rivet in it. And now it was at an English airfield and English engineers were taking it apart and learning everything we knew." Kurt Tank received the report of Faber's capture with the specific horror of a designer who understands immediately what the loss of an intact operational example of his aircraft means for the secrecy of his design. The BMW 801's power curve, the wing's aerodynamic characteristics, the armament installation geometry, the cockpit's ergonomic design, everything that had made the FW-190 superior to the Spitfire V for 8 months was now available for Allied examination in the most direct possible form. "They will know everything now," Tank told Luftwaffe Command in his assessment of the capture's consequences. "They will know what it can do and what it cannot do. They will build their tactics around what it cannot do." He began immediately on the question of what needed to change. The FW-190 4 variant incorporating refinements, and the longer-term development of the FW-190D with the Jumo 213 inline engine that would restore something of the aircraft's performance advantage once the Allies had built their tactics around the A3's specific limitations. His post-war assessment of the capture's strategic impact was delivered with the precision of a man who had spent years calculating exactly what those weeks in the summer of 1942 had cost. It shortened the period during which the aircraft had the advantage by approximately 6 to 12 months, Tank said. Without the capture, the Allies would have developed counter-tactics eventually. The capture gave them in 6 weeks what would otherwise have taken a year. Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdflieger with 104 aerial victories and the institutional responsibility for the entire German fighter arm, received the report with the controlled fury of a commander who understands the dimensions of what has been lost and cannot punish the man who lost it because the man who lost it made a navigation error during a genuine engagement, and courts-martial are not appropriate instruments for navigation errors. "You have given the enemy our finest weapon," Galland told Faber, according to his memoirs. "Not by cowardice. Not by treachery. By the kind of mistake that combat produces and that cannot be undone." Wing Commander Hugh Wilson climbed into the cockpit of Faber's FW-190 at RAF Duxford on July 3, 1942, 10 days after the capture, the aircraft examined, serviced, and cleared for flight by the Air Fighting Development Unit's engineers who had spent those 10 days learning the aircraft's systems from the outside before Wilson was asked to learn them from the inside. He approached the first flight with the preparation of an experienced test pilot who understood that he was about to fly a German aircraft whose handling characteristics were unknown from the cockpit, and that unknown characteristics in a high-performance fighter are the specific category of unknown that kills test pilots. His first flight lasted long enough to establish that the aircraft was stable, flyable, and responsive, and to begin the systematic assessment that the RAF needed with the urgency of an organization that had been losing pilots to this aircraft for 8 months and needed to stop. He described the cockpit with the professional appreciation of a man who recognizes good design when he sits inside it. The controls were logically placed. The instruments well positioned. The pilot's view good. Then he flew it, and the roll rate produced the specific visceral impression that every pilot who flew the aircraft subsequently described. The ailerons so responsive, the transition from one attitude to another so immediate, that the aircraft seemed to anticipate intention rather than respond to input. He flew it multiple times through July and August, working systematically through the performance envelope, measuring and recording every number that the RAF needed. The key tactical finding emerged from the high-speed testing. Above 200 miles per hour, the FW-190's ailerons became heavy. Above 250 miles per hour, the roll rate that Priller had described as extraordinary dropped to something that a well-flown Spitfire could contest. The roll that no Allied fighter could follow existed only within a specific speed range. Wilson had found the range. The next question was what to do with it. The tactical bulletin that RAF Fighter Command distributed to its Spitfire V squadrons after Wilson's evaluation reached Bobby Oxspring with the specific impact of a document that confirms everything a man has been saying for months and has not been believed. Everything I had written in my combat reports for 6 months was in that bulletin, Oxspring said in his post-war account. Everything I had been told was probably exaggeration. Now it was official doctrine. The bulletin's instructions were precise and derived directly from Wilson's numbers. Do not follow the FW-190 in a rolling break. Do not attempt to pursue it in a dive. Force it into a sustained turning engagement at low speed where the Spitfire V's tighter turn radius, the one performance advantage Wilson's evaluation had confirmed, could be exploited. The pilots who had been dying over France and the Channel in Spitfire versus had been dying because they were fighting the FW-190 on its terms, in the rolling, diving engagements where its advantages were greatest. The bulletin told them to stop. It told them what terms they could fight it on instead. Sergeant Pilot Raymond Harries of 131 Squadron, who had survived his early FW-190 encounters by running rather than fighting and who would accumulate 15 aerial victories later in the war, described receiving the bulletin with the relief of a man who has been handed the specific information that he needed and had not had. I had been trained to fight the Messerschmitt, Harries said. The FW-190 was not the Messerschmitt. My training was wrong for the aircraft I was facing. The bulletin gave me the right training. Brian Kincombe's assessment of what changed after the bulletin reached the squadrons was the assessment of a senior fighter commander watching the statistics improve. The capture told us exactly what it was, Kincombe said. Once you know exactly what something is, you know how to fight it. Before the capture we were guessing. After it we were not. The American dimension of what Faber had delivered to RAF Pembrey on June 23, 1942 moved through the Allied intelligence sharing apparatus with the urgency of information that every officer who handled it understood was operationally critical to forces that were either already flying against the FW-190 or would be flying against it within months. General Carl Spaatz commanded the 8th Air Force during the buildup of American air power in Britain, a commander whose operational responsibilities required him to understand exactly what his fighter pilots would face when they began flying combat missions over France and Germany, and whose reception of the FW-190 intelligence briefing was described by his staff as immediate and direct. Tell the fighter groups, Spaatz said after the briefing, according to his operations officer's account. All of it. Everything Wilson found. Every number. I want every P-47 pilot who flies against this aircraft to know exactly what it can do before he meets it. His directive was the command decision that converted the RAF's intelligence windfall into American tactical doctrine, the specific institutional step between a test pilot's findings at Duxford and a fighter pilot's survival over France. Brigadier General Frank Hunter, commanding 8 Fighter Command, implemented the directive with the operational thoroughness of a commander who understood that the difference between a pilot who knows the FW-190's performance envelope and a pilot who does not is often the difference between a pilot who comes home and a pilot who does not. His instruction to group commanders was specific and unambiguous. Your pilots will fly against this aircraft. They will be at a disadvantage at medium altitude. They will be at an advantage above 25,000 feet and in high-speed dives. Train them to fight from their advantages and refuse the engagements that favor the FW-190. The doctrine was clear. The question was whether the pilots who received it could execute it under the specific pressure of combat, where instinct consistently competes with training and where the instinct to follow a braking fighter is one of the strongest instincts a fighter pilot carries. Colonel Cass Hoff flew the captured FW-190 at Duxford with the specific analytical frame of an American test pilot whose reference point was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the aircraft that American fighter groups in Britain were flying and would fly against the FW-190 in the European theater. His evaluation was not Wilson's evaluation repeated but Wilson's evaluation extended, the same aircraft assessed against a different opponent, The same performance numbers interpreted through the tactical lens of a different fighter with different strengths and different vulnerabilities. The P-47 was a large, heavy aircraft, significantly heavier than the Fw-190, heavier than the Spitfire, built with the structural robustness of an American industrial philosophy that did not sacrifice protection for performance in the way that Horikoshi had sacrificed protection for performance in the Zero, and tank had balanced the two more carefully in the Fw-190. It was slower than the Fw-190 at medium altitude. Its roll rate was inferior. At high altitude, above 25,000 feet, it was faster than the Fw-190, and its performance advantage increased with altitude. In a high-speed dive from altitude, it could reach speeds that the Fw-190's structural limits prevented it from matching. Hoff's report translated these findings into the tactical language that American pilots needed. The Fw-190 is superior to the P-47 in rate of roll and in acceleration at medium altitude, he wrote. The P-47 is superior to the Fw-190 above 25,000 feet and in a high-speed dive from altitude. American pilots should maintain altitude and use the dive. They should not attempt to match the Fw-190 in a rolling engagement at medium altitude. The report reached 8 Fighter Command and became the foundational document of American Fw-190 tactical doctrine, the specific intelligence translation that turned Faber's navigation error into American pilot survival. Colonel Hubert Zemke arrived in Britain with the 56th Fighter Group in January 1943 and spent the months before the group's first combat operations in the specific preparation of a commander who intends to use the available intelligence completely rather than treating it as background reading. He flew the captured Fw-190 at Duxford himself. He wanted to understand the aircraft from the inside before he developed tactics to defeat it, wanted the cockpit knowledge that only flying an aircraft produces, the specific embodied understanding of how it felt at the limits of its performance that no written report could fully convey. His assessment after flying it was the assessment of a man who recognized an exceptional machine and immediately began the process of identifying its specific weaknesses. "It is a magnificent aircraft," Zemke said. "Its roll rate is the best I have ever experienced. It accelerates in a dive faster than anything I have flown. These are its strengths. Its weakness is above 25,000 feet and when forced into a sustained turning fight at low speed. I will build my tactics around those two weaknesses." The tactical formation he developed, the Zemke fan, spreading his P-47s across a wide front at high altitude, was designed to intercept German fighters before they could engage American bombers, using the P-47's high-altitude performance to get above the Fw-190 and then diving to attack from the energy advantage that altitude provided. His doctrine was the direct operational expression of what Hoff's evaluation had found and what Faber's capture had made possible, a tactical system built precisely around the enemy aircraft's documented performance envelope, exploiting the specific gaps in that envelope that Wilson and Hoff had identified and that Tank had not known were being identified when Jeffries pulled Faber out of his cockpit in Wales. Don Blakesley commanded the 4th Fighter Group, built around the nucleus of the RAF's Eagle squadrons, the American volunteer pilots who had been flying with the RAF since 1940 and 1941 and who had been flying against the Fw-190 in Spitfires since before America entered the war. Their transfer to the USAF in September 1942 brought into the American system something that no intelligence report could fully replicate, the embodied combat knowledge of pilots who had survived the Nonsuch period, who had learned the Fw-190's capabilities from the most direct possible source, who had paid in colleagues' lives for the understanding that they were carrying into the American fighter groups that were now arriving in Britain without that experience. Blakesley described the specific value of what the Eagle Squadron veterans brought with them with the directness of a man who had been there for the education. "We had already paid for the knowledge of what the Fw-190 could do," he said. "We paid in pilots we lost before we understood it. When we transferred to the American system, we carried that knowledge with us. The new pilots didn't have to pay for it again." The intelligence from Wilson's evaluation and Hoff's assessment gave the arriving American pilots the quantitative knowledge, the specific numbers, the altitude thresholds, the speed ranges. The Eagle Squadron veterans gave them something else, the specific texture of what it felt like to be in a Spitfire V when an FW-190 rolled away from you and you could not follow it, the embodied memory of the engagements that had killed men who followed their instincts rather than the doctrine. The two forms of knowledge together, the intelligence report and the combat survivor's account, produced a pilot who understood the FW-190 in the multiple ways that survival required. Lieutenant Robert Johnson flew his P-47 against FW-190s over France and the Netherlands through the spring and summer of 1943, and his most documented encounter with the aircraft occurred on June 26, 1943. A day that confirmed everything that Hoff's evaluation report had said about the P-47's structural robustness in the specific currency of a pilot who absorbed the confirmation in his cockpit at combat altitude. Unteroffizier Erich Schwartz of JG-2 got behind Johnson's P-47 and fired. He fired repeatedly, multiple passes, the textbook attack position maintained, the rounds striking the American aircraft with the visible impact that an FW-190 pilot could see from his cockpit. Johnson's P-47 absorbed approximately 21 hits from 20 mm cannon fire and machine gun rounds and kept flying, the aircraft's structural strength receiving the punishment that Schwartz's ammunition was delivering and declining to be destroyed by it. Schwartz ran out of ammunition. "I hit it many times," he said in a post-war account. "I could see my rounds striking the aircraft. It would not go down. I ran out of ammunition." The American flew away. Johnson flew the damaged P-47 to Manston Airfield in Kent, the aircraft barely flyable, the structure holding what the hits had done to it together by the margin that American construction had built into it. He filed his after-action report from Manston with the specific calmness of a man who has been very close to dying and has had enough time in the air on the way home to process the proximity. "The FW-190 is a killer," Johnson wrote. "It would have killed me in a less rugged aircraft. I survived because of what the Thunderbolt is built to take." He would accumulate 28 aerial victories before the war ended, every one of them built on the tactical doctrine derived from the aircraft that Faber had landed in Wales and the structural robustness of the aircraft that Schwartz had been unable to destroy. Captain Walter Mahurin flew his 21 victories in the 56th Fighter Group with the specific mental discipline of a pilot who has thought carefully about what he is doing and why before each mission and who executes the doctrine with the consistency that the doctrine's survival guarantees require. His pre-mission preparation was systematic, a review of the FW-190's documented performance envelope before every sortie, a deliberate rehearsal of the tactical decisions that the doctrine specified and that his instincts would challenge when the combat began. "Before every mission I reviewed what the FW-190 could do and what it could not do," Mahurin said in a post-war account. "I reminded myself of the numbers, the altitude where I was advantaged, the altitude where it was advantaged, the speed at which its roll rate became dangerous and the speed at which it did not matter. I flew the doctrine." Pilots who improvised against the FW-190 at medium altitude died. "I did not improvise." His description of resisting the instinct to follow an FW-190 through a rolling break is the clearest account of the specific psychological demand that the doctrine imposed on the pilots who were asked to execute it. The instinct said follow it. Every fighter pilot instinct I had said stay with the aircraft, don't let it escape, follow the brake. The doctrine said let it go. The doctrine was right. The instinct would have killed me. The doctrine that saved Mahurin had been derived from Wilson's evaluation, which had been made possible by Jeffrey's run across the airfield, which had been made necessary by Faber's navigation error over the Bristol Channel. The chain of causation from a German pilot's confusion to an American pilot's survival running through every link in the sequence with the specific precision of a chain whose strength is determined by its weakest link, and the weakest link had held. The October 14, 1943 Schweinfurt raid produced loss rates that made the continuation of deep penetration bombing without escort impossible. 60 B-17s lost out of 291 dispatched. A 20% loss rate that the 8th Air Force's replacement pipeline could not sustain, and that Spaatz and his commanders understood immediately had changed the terms on which unescorted bombing could be conducted. The Fw-190s that had attacked the bomber formations on the route to and from the target had done so with the specific effectiveness of an aircraft that had been designed for exactly this engagement: heavy armament, good speed, the structural robustness of the BMW 801 radial making it capable of flying through the defensive fire of the B-17 formations and surviving hits that a less robustly built aircraft might not survive. The P-47s that escorted the bombers had been limited by their range. They could protect the bombers to the German border and no further, and beyond the German border the bombers were alone against a Luftwaffe fighter force that understood exactly how to attack unescorted heavy bombers. The intelligence from the Fw-190 evaluation had given American pilots the tactical doctrine to fight the aircraft effectively when they encountered it. What it could not give them was the range to be present at every point in the bomber's flight path where the Fw-190 was waiting. That problem required a different solution: a fighter with the P-47's combat capability and a range that the P-47's fuel capacity did not provide. The solution was the North American P-51 Mustang with drop tanks, which entered the European theater in December 1943 and whose pilots were trained against the Fw-190 using the same evaluation framework that had been established from Faber's captured aircraft. The performance envelope known, the tactical doctrine derived, the specific weaknesses documented and taught. Major Egon Mayer had pioneered the frontal attack against American bombers. The specific tactic of approaching the B-17 formations from dead ahead, where the defensive armament was weakest, firing through the nose of the formation and breaking away before the bomber's guns could track the attacking fighter. His 102 aerial victories were built substantially on the effectiveness of this tactic and on the Fw-190's performance advantages over the fighters that were attempting to intercept him. He was killed on March 2, 1944, shot down during a frontal attack on a B-17 formation, the tactic he had developed turned against him by the bomber's nose guns that the Luftwaffe's improved frontal attacks had forced the Americans to upgrade. His death in the spring of 1944 was the death of a pilot whose operational context had been transformed since the summer of 1942. The Allied fighter pilots he was now fighting against knew the Fw-190's performance envelope in detail, flew aircraft that could contest it at altitude, and executed tactical doctrines that had been derived from the specific intelligence that one of his own wings pilots had accidentally delivered to RAF Pembrey 20 months earlier. The JG-2 that Mayer had served since the beginning of the war was still a formidable organization, but it was fighting an Allied air force that understood exactly what it was fighting, and the 8 months of advantage that the Fw-190's secrecy had provided were gone, traded for the specific clarity that Jeffrey's run across a Welsh airfield had produced. Adolf Galland flew his last combat missions of the war in the Me-262 jet fighter, commanding JV-44, the unit of experienced aces that he assembled in the war's final months to demonstrate what the jet could do against the Allied bomber formations. His assessment of the Fw-190 capture's place among the intelligence disasters that had most significantly damaged German air power in the West was delivered in his post-war memoirs with the specific honesty of a man who had processed the war's events across years of reflection and arrived at conclusions he was willing to state directly. He ranked the Fw-190 capture among 3 events that had most damaged German air power, alongside the capture of the Ju-88 night fighter with its radar in May 1943 and the American discovery that the P-51 Mustang with drop tanks could escort bombers to Berlin. The Fw-190 had given U.S. air superiority over France and the Channel for 8 months, Galland wrote. The capture ended that air superiority within weeks. We had to fight with the same aircraft against enemies who now knew exactly what it could and could not do. His inability to punish Faber remained with him, The specific frustration of a commander who understood the military justice system's distinction between negligence and combat error and who accepted that distinction intellectually while remaining unable to fully accommodate its consequences emotionally. A good pilot who made one mistake at the worst possible moment for his country, Galland said of Faber in his post-war account. The assessment was accurate, fair, and completely insufficient to describe what one navigation error over the Bristol Channel had cost the Luftwaffe and given the Allied pilots who were flying against it. Like this video now, because in the final section of this story, the pilots who used what Faber had given them took it all the way to Berlin. Don Blakesley led the 4th Fighter Group on the first escort mission to Berlin on March 4, 1944. The P-51 Mustangs of his group flying to the German capital and back with the range that the drop tanks provided and the tactical knowledge that the FW-190 evaluation had informed and the combat experience that the Eagle Squadron veterans had carried from their Spitfire V days through the transition to American aircraft. The mission was the operational culmination of everything that had been set in motion by Faber's landing at Pembrey 21 months earlier, not directly, not in the clean causal chain that history rarely provides, but in the specific sense that the Allied fighter pilots who flew to Berlin in March 1944 did so with a complete understanding of the German fighter they would face that the pilots who had been dying over the Channel in the winter of 1941–42 had not possessed. The intelligence from the captured FW-190 had informed the doctrine that Zemke had built the 56th Group around, that Hunter had distributed through 8 Fighter Command, that Blakesley's Eagle Squadron veterans had supplemented with their embodied combat knowledge, that Mahurin had reviewed before every mission and executed with the discipline that the doctrine required. The Berlin mission was possible because the P-51 had the range. The Berlin mission was survivable because the pilots who flew it knew what they were facing and how to fight it. Both of those things were true on March 4, 1944. Only the second of them had been made true on June 23, 1942. The spring and summer of 1944 represented the full maturation of everything that the FW-190 capture had set in motion. Not as a single tactical improvement applied to a single engagement but as the systematic transformation of Allied air power in the European theater from a force that had been fighting Germany's most capable fighter without fully understanding it into a force that had built its doctrine, its training, its tactical formations, and its pilot survival expectations around a complete understanding of exactly what the FW-190 could do and exactly where it could not follow. Hub Zemke's 56th Fighter Group accumulated aerial victories against FW-190s and Bf-109s through 1943 and into 1944 at a kill ratio that 8th Air Force commanders described as the best in the theater. Approximately 665 aerial victories against losses that the doctrine's discipline had kept significantly lower than the loss rates of the pre-doctrine period. The doctrine's specific contribution to that ratio was the reduction of the most avoidable losses, the pilots who had been dying because they followed an FW-190 through a rolling break at medium altitude, because they tried to pursue it in a dive from below 20,000 feet, because their instincts told them to stay with the aircraft and the aircraft's performance envelope made staying with it fatal. Those pilots were not dying anymore. They were dying for other reasons. The FW-190 remained a dangerous opponent and the skies over Germany in 1943 and 1944 remained one of the most lethal environments any military force has ever operated in, but they were not dying for the specific reason that had been killing them before June 23, 1942, which was that they did not know what they were fighting and were fighting it on its terms. Zemke had given them terms of his own. The terms had come from Wilson's evaluation. Wilson's evaluation had come from Jeffrey's run. Jeffrey's run had come from Faber's wave. The chain was intact from the Welsh airfield to the skies over Germany, and the chain was holding. Robert Johnson's survival of the June 26, 1943 engagement, 21 hits from Erich Schwartz's cannon and machine gun fire, the P-47 absorbing what the FW-190's ammunition delivered and declining to be destroyed by it, had become one of the most cited individual accounts in the 8th Air Force's documentation of P-47 survivability, and its circulation through the fighter groups had produced a specific effect on the pilots who read it that went beyond the tactical intelligence it contained. The account confirmed something that the pre-mission briefings described in the abstract and that Johnson had confirmed in the most direct possible way, that the P-47 could be hit repeatedly, and could keep flying, and that a pilot in a P-47 who was being attacked by an Fw-190 had a margin of structural survivability that allowed him to absorb the attack and respond to it in ways that the doctrine specified rather than in the panic of a pilot who believes his aircraft is about to come apart. Johnson flew 28 aerial victories in the P-47 using the doctrine that Zemke had derived from the evaluation data and the structural confidence that his own survival of Schwartz's attack had given him. The two elements of tactical knowledge combining in the specific way that only embodied experience in combat can combine them. He described the doctrine's central demand with the economy of a man who had tested it in the most direct possible way. "You use your altitude," Johnson said in his post-war account. "You use your dive. You do not roll with it at medium altitude and you do not try to follow it when it breaks. You reset and you come back from above." The pilots who followed this doctrine and survived to accumulate the aerial victories that the 56th Group's record documented were following a tactical system derived from an aircraft that had been sitting intact on a Welsh airfield in the summer of 1942, a system that Faber had made possible and that Jeffries had made necessary by being faster than Faber's realization of where he was. The Spitfire IX's operational introduction in June 1942, almost simultaneous with Faber's capture, completed the British side of the response that Group Captain Broadhurst had demanded in his winter assessment, a better aircraft and better intelligence on the existing aircraft's limitations. The better aircraft arrived with the Merlin 61 engine producing significantly more power than the Merlin in the Spitfire V, giving the new variant a performance envelope that the Wilson evaluation had confirmed was sufficient to contest the Fw-190 on roughly equal terms. Wing Commander Brian Kincombe's assessment of what the Spitfire 9 changed described the transformation from the perspective of a senior fighter commander watching the engagement statistics shift from the none-such period's one-sided results towards something that pilot skill rather than aircraft performance determined. "The Spitfire 9 made the contest competitive," Kincombe said. "Before it, we were losing. After it, we were roughly equal. The capture told us exactly how equal we needed to be." The specific contribution of the Wilson evaluation to the Spitfire 9 program was the performance target. The exact numbers that the new variant needed to match gave the development program a concrete specification rather than an estimated one. The difference between designing toward a known opponent and designing toward an assessed one. Raymond Harries, who had survived his early Fw-190 encounters by running and who would become one of the RAF's successful aces in the Spitfire 9, described the specific experience of flying the new variant against an aircraft he had previously been unable to fight. "In the Spitfire V, the Fw-190 was an aircraft I could not engage on equal terms," Harries said. "In the Spitfire 9 it was an aircraft I could fight." The capture gave us the knowledge of what equal terms looked like. The Spitfire 9 gave us the aircraft to fly on those terms. Joseph Priller flew the Fw-190 from the aircraft's first operational deployments through the Normandy campaign and beyond, accumulating 101 aerial victories against the specific background of an air war that had begun with his aircraft dominant and had evolved into something that his aircraft's unchanged performance could no longer dominate in the way it had in the winter of 1941–42. His account of the transformation described the change from the German pilot's perspective with the honest assessment of a man who had been present for both the dominance and its erosion. "In early 1942 the Allied pilots came at us in ways we understood and could defeat," Priller said in a post-war account. "By late 1942 they had changed. They stopped following us through rolls. They stopped trying to pursue us in dives. They began forcing us into the turns where we were less advantaged. They had learned our limits." His description of what had changed is the German pilots' confirmation of what the Allied tactical bulletins had instructed, The specific change in Allied behavior that the FW-190 evaluation had produced, documented from the cockpit of the aircraft that the evaluation had been conducted on. He had not known in 1941 that an Allied pilot watching him roll would eventually know the speed at which his ailerons became heavy, had not known that the specific limitation tank had built into the aircraft's aerodynamics would be quantified by a British test pilot at Duxford and distributed to every Allied fighter squadron in the European theater. By 1943 he knew. He could see it in the way the Allied pilots were fighting him. They knew what he could do. They had stopped giving him the opportunities to do it. Kurt Tank watched the evolution of the air war over France and Germany through 1943 and into 1944 with the specific attention of a designer whose work was the subject of the fighting, who understood the aircraft's capabilities and limitations from the engineering level and who could assess the Allied tactical changes against that understanding with the precision of a man who knew both sides of the equation. His assessment of how the Allies were using the evaluation intelligence was delivered in his post-war interviews with the professional candor of a man who respected the quality of the response to his design. They used it correctly, Tank said. They found the altitude where the aircraft was less effective and they fought there. They found the speed range where the roll rate was reduced and they denied us the lower speeds where it was not reduced. They built a tactical system around the aircraft's specific performance envelope. It was the correct response. His development of the FW-190D, the long-nosed variant with the Jumo 213 inline engine, was his specific answer to the tactical system the Allies had derived from his captured aircraft, changed the performance envelope so thoroughly that the existing evaluation data was no longer current. The D variant's maximum speed of approximately 426 miles per hour and its improved performance at altitude changed the tactical picture enough that Allied pilots encountering it in September 1944 found that some of the numbers they had been working from no longer applied. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group noted the difference in his after-action reports and made the specific recommendation that Wilson's work at Duxford 2 years earlier had established as the correct response to an unknown aircraft. The D version requires updated assessment, Meyer wrote. The evaluation data we have is for the A version. The institutional response to Faber's capture had become the institutional framework for responding to every subsequent German aircraft development. The principle that you find the enemy aircraft, you fly it, you find its limits, and you build your tactics around those limits. Tank had taught the Allies the principle by losing the aircraft that demonstrated it. Armin Faber spent the remainder of the war in prisoner-of-war camps, first in Britain, then in Canada, the standard procedure for Luftwaffe prisoners whose knowledge made proximity to active operations a security consideration. He had years in which to process what had happened on June 23, 1942, years in which the specific chain of events that his navigation error had initiated continued its consequences in the skies over France and Germany and the Netherlands while he was in captivity and unable to observe those consequences or affect them. His post-war account of the capture described the navigation error with the specific honesty of a man who had arrived, across years of reflection, at a complete understanding of exactly how it had happened and who had long since ceased to find comfort in any of the explanations that the circumstances permitted. I confused north for south, Faber said in a post-war interview. In the combat I had lost my orientation. The Bristol Channel looked like the Channel. The airfield looked like a French airfield. I was certain I was home. I was certain until the moment I was not. The economy of those words, the specific compression of an event whose consequences he understood completely into the simplest possible description of its mechanism, is itself the most accurate portrait available of the man who had made the error. He did not exaggerate the circumstances. He did not minimize the consequences. He stated what had happened with the directness of a man who had processed it fully and had arrived at the only account of it that was entirely true. He was certain until the moment he was not. Warrant Officer Jeffries had made certain that the moment came before Faber could act on the certainty that had preceded it, and the specific timing of that moment, the gap between Faber's realization and the possibility of any action on that realization, was the gap in which the air war over Europe had changed. The pilots who flew against the Fw-190 in the final year of the war flew against an aircraft that the Luftwaffe was increasingly unable to man with the quality of pilots that the aircraft deserved. The trained pilot cadre that had built the JG-2 and JG-26 kill tallies of 2,900 and 2,700 respectively consumed by attrition that the German training system could not replace at the quality level the pre-war program had produced. The replacement pilots arriving at JG-2 in 1944 had months of training rather than years. They could fly the Fw-190, but they had not developed the specific mastery that Priller described, the instinctive integration of aircraft capability and combat judgment that distinguished the pre-war trained pilot from the wartime replacement. The tactical system that Zemke had built against the Fw-190's documented performance envelope had been designed for the aircraft at its best, flown by experienced pilots with the full mastery of its capabilities. Against inexperienced pilots who had the aircraft's performance available but not the knowledge to use it completely, the Allied tactical system was not merely effective but overwhelming. Gallen's observation that the Fw-190 had given Germany 8 months of air superiority over France and the Channel was the correct accounting of what the aircraft's secrecy had provided, and his observation that the capture had ended that superiority within weeks was the correct accounting of what Faber's landing had cost. The 8 months that the secrecy had bought were the 8 months in which the Luftwaffe had established the operational patterns and the pilot confidence that the subsequent 2 years of air war gradually dismantled as the doctrine derived from Wilson's evaluation made the Allied air forces progressively more effective against the specific aircraft that the evaluation had been conducted on. The story that the Fw-190 capture tells about intelligence and tactical development is the story that the Zero capture tells and that the Thatchweave tells and that the Ultra intercepts tell, the story of a war in which the systematic exploitation of available information was as decisive as the production of aircraft and the training of pilots, and in which the institutional commitment to understanding the enemy completely before fighting him produced survival rates and kill ratios that the enemy, fighting without the same commitment to the same completeness of understanding, could not match. The RAF's willingness to share the Fw-190 evaluation data with the USAF was the specific institutional decision that made the American tactical doctrine possible. The Allied intelligence sharing arrangement working as its architects had intended it to work, turning one nation's intelligence windfall into two nations' tactical advantage. Spatz's directive to distribute the intelligence to every P-47 group in 8th Air Force was the specific command decision that made the sharing operationally effective. The senior commander who understood that intelligence is only as useful as its distribution, that a test pilot's findings at Duxford save no lives until they reach the pilot over France who needs them. Hunter's implementation of the doctrine through 8 Fighter Command was the organizational step that turned the directive into the specific content of the pre-mission briefings and training programs that American fighter pilots carried into the cockpit with them when they met the Fw-190 over Germany. The chain from Faber's landing to the pilot who survived his Fw-190 engagement over Schweinfurt ran through every link in this sequence: the capture, the evaluation, the sharing, the directive, the implementation, the doctrine, the survival, and each link held because the people responsible for it understood what was at stake and did what the stakes required. The final accounting of what Armin Faber's navigation error on the afternoon of June 23, 1942 produced requires the specific arithmetic of the historian rather than the specific drama of the narrative. The assessment of what 8 months of Fw-190 dominance over the Channel had cost the RAF and what the end of that dominance within weeks of the capture cost the Luftwaffe, set against the impossible calculation of the engagements that the doctrine prevented from happening in the ways they would have happened without it. Kurt Tank's estimate, 6 to 12 months of advantage shortened, the counter-tactics arriving in 6 weeks rather than a year, is the most precise quantification available from a participant who understood both sides of the equation and who had the specific professional credibility of the aircraft's designer. 6 to 12 months in the air war over Europe in 1942 and 1943 was not an abstraction. It was the Battle of Britain's entire duration again. It was the P-47 groups that arrived in England in 1943 trained in a doctrine derived from the evaluation rather than trained by the loss of the pilots who would have had to develop the same doctrine from combat experience. It was Johnson absorbing Schwartz's 21 hits and flying home because he knew to use altitude, and Schwartz had been unable to get him into the medium-altitude rolling engagement where the FW-190's advantages were greatest. It was Mahurin reviewing the performance numbers before every mission and resisting the instinct that would have killed him. It was Blakesley leading the 1st Berlin escort and Harries flying the Spitfire 9 with the understanding of what equal terms looked like. All of it traced back to a Welsh airfield on a June afternoon, to a German pilot who confused north for south, to a British warrant officer who ran before anyone else moved, to a German aircraft sitting intact on a runway in Carmarthenshire with every one of its secrets available to the men who would spend the rest of the war using them. Commanders and key figures involved in this historic event, for educational purposes. Oberleutnant Armin Faber, pilot, 3/JG2, FW-190 captured at RAF Pembrey. Warrant Officer Jeffries, RAF Pembrey, captured Faber. Flying Officer Peter Stephanie, 310, Czechoslovak, Squadron RAF, shot down by Faber. Wing Commander Hugh Wilson, test pilot, RAF Air Fighting Development Unit. Flight Lieutenant A.F. Martindale, AFU test pilot. Colonel Cass Hoff, USAF test pilot, 8th Fighter Command. General Karl T. Spatz, Commanding General, 8th Air Force. Brigadier General Frank Hunter, 8th Fighter Command. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, Commanding Officer, 56th Fighter Group. Major Don Blakesley, 4th Fighter Group. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, 56th Fighter Group. Captain Walter Mahurin, 56th Fighter Group. General Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger. Major Egon Mayer, D. Oberleutnant Joseph Pips Prille, T-26. Major Walter Osa, T-2 Commander. Kurt Tank, Designer, Focke-Wulf Fw-190. Squadron Leader S.D. Felkin, RAF Intelligence. Squadron Leader Bobby Oxspring, 66 Squadron RAF. Wing Commander Al Deer, RAF Fighter Command. Wing Commander Brian Kinkum, RAF Fighter Command. Group Captain Harry Broadhurst, RAF Fighter Command. Unteroffizier Eric Schwartz, JG2. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Schilling, JG2 Ground Crew. Flight Lieutenant Ken Mackenzie, RAF Pembrey. Wing Commander Jamie Rankin, 92 Squadron RAF. Sergeant Pilot Raymond Harries, 131 Squadron RAF. Time: late 1941, late 1944. Dates: FW-190 enters operational service, late 1941 June 23, 1942. Faber lands at RAF Pembrey July 3, 1942. First British evaluation flight, August-September 1942. American evaluation, April 1943. P-47 first operations from England, October 14, 1943. Second Schweinfurt raid, March 4, 1944. First Berlin escort mission, September 1944. FW-190D enters service. Locations: RAF Pembrey, Carmarthenshire, Wales, RAF Duxford, Cambridgeshire 8th Air Force HQ, High Wycombe JG2 bases, Northern France, Bristol Channel, English Channel. Units involved: 3/JG2 Richthofen JG26, 56th Fighter Group USAF, 4th Fighter Group USAF, 310, Czechoslovak, Squadron RAF, RAF Air Fighting Development Unit, 8th Fighter Command.